The Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine Institute for Legislative Action presents Leadership Through Action. Now, here are your hosts, David Trahan and Mike Shaw.
Welcome to this week's show, Leadership Through Action, a production of the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine Institute for Legislative Action. You're listening to Dave and Mike, and this week, Mike, we've got a great guest coming up, Senator Collin.
Absolutely.
And then later in the show, Matt Dunlap's going to try to come on and explain ranked choice voting to the listeners. People will be voting and ranking their choices for president, as well as the some of the congressional seats. So we want to have Matt come on, and you can hear it right from the Secretary of State.
Right.
So we always start our show with a what have you done in the outdoors, Mike and Dave? And then we talk a little bit about what we did in the last week. And so, Mike, I'll start with you.
Well, we have quite a story today. We went out, David, Becky, myself, and Becky's son, Duncan, went out on the Nor'easter fishing boat out of Kennebunk on an offshore ground fishing trip. And, boy, we had a great trip. And you couldn't ask for a nicer day, weather-wise, wind-wise,
whales
and
everywhere,
fish-wise,
dolphins. It was so awesome.
And we brought home so much fish for the freezer and for the frying pan. It was crazy. Yeah. Big pollock, tons of haddock.
Yeah.
And I didn't really see much of anything else as far as fish go. So a lot of times when I go out on the Nor'easter, I see redfish or cusk, but
few cod. We caught a few cod.
Yeah, cod we did. Of
8
course,
or 10 cod.
We have to throw those back.
Yeah.
And actually, maybe we should talk to the senator about trying to expand a little cod take for the charter boats and small businesses in Maine for sure. That'll be a good topic.
Yeah. Well, I guess before we get started, I want to make a little statement. This is the political arm of the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine. It's the Institute for Legislative Action. And this show is right before the election now. And I was thinking earlier, and I'll have Senator Collins come on in a minute, and I was trying to, I guess, frame up how this election has gone for me with all this political spending and just grotesque amounts of money coming into the state. And reminds me of having a cap put on my tooth the other day. I went in the dentist's office, and it started out with several painful shots in the mouth. These ads that came on were painful in the beginning, and about 10 minutes into the procedure, it wasn't numb quite yet, so I had to have the doctor come back with some more Novocaine. He kept giving me shots till it was finally numb, and that's kind of where I am now, is in the numb stage of this election, where it's getting past the pain almost, but it's just I can't wait for it to be over. It took 4 hours to get the cap put on my tooth.
Wow.
And then I had to have another filling put in. But that's how this election feels.
It's about how many hours of ads there are in an hour-long TV show.
Exactly. Oh, it's just been a very painful election cycle, and thank God when I finally get out in the parking lot and my mouth was numb and I was drooling all over my steering wheel. Nice. I'll be glad when this is over with.
Sometimes you just think, you sit back and you wonder of all the money just on the Senate, the U.S. Senate race, of all that money. Think about all the stuff that we could do with that money.
All the good that could have been done.
We could conserve thousands and thousands of acres for the next generations of Mainers, for hunting and fishing and hiking and bird watching.
Yeah, 130 million, Mike, was the last number I've heard.
I know, it's crazy.
There's only 1.3 million people in this state. I mean, how much can you spend on getting a single vote?
That's true, yeah, if you break it down I wonder how many registered voters there are. You could divide it by that number.
Even if you had a big turnout and 70% of the people voted, it's still
600,000, 700,000 people maybe to vote. So divide the 130 million by that, and you get a big sum of money per person there.
Yeah. Well, I know our next guest is probably as frustrated with the election as we are. With that, welcome, Senator Collins, and we'll give you a minute to introduce yourself. And I want you to know, Senator, that we're not going to speak for you. One of the reasons we wanted to have you on, and we did invite Speaker Gideon as well to come on, is it seems like everybody is talking for the candidates and their own voices are getting drowned out by all the negativity. And we wanted to invite the candidates to come on and just talk about kind of what they wanted to talk about and get some more personal interaction and let people speak for themselves. And with that, welcome Senator Collins. And if you'd like to speak a little bit about that, we welcome it.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Dave and Mike. I really appreciate the great work that the Sportsman Alliance of Maine does and the invitation to join you on your radio program. I couldn't help but agree with the comments that you were making as I was listening and waiting to get on. This election has been unlike any other that I have ever seen. And I know that, Dave, you were comparing it to getting a cap. I would say it's more like a root canal.
Well, I've never had one of those, and I hope I never do. But if it's worse than this, I don't want one.
It's way worse.
I'll have them pull the thing.
Yeah.
And I just think campaigns are starting too early, they're lasting too long, and they cost too much. And the amount of money that has been poured in by dark money groups from out of state is just obscene. And as Mike says, think of the good that a lot of that money could have done. And that's why I think really having complete disclosure so that we know who's behind groups like Maine Momentum and 16 counties, these dark money groups that are pretending to be educational in nature so that they can avoid disclosing their donors the way that candidates have to do if you get direct money. That's one of the changes that we need, and it needs to apply across the board. But it is unlike anything I've ever seen. My opponent set a world record in Maine for the amount of dark money that has come in to attack me and support her. But today, let's talk about issues that are more fun, and that is protecting and preserving Maine's great outdoors.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry.
I said absolutely. That's a wonderful topic. And I know you've been a leader in this area. I wrote a column in the Kennebec Journal, Senator. I'm sorry if I interrupted you, but I wanted to get this in. I did the research for that column. It took me about a week. And as I was doing the research, I couldn't help but say to myself, holy cow, I had no idea how extensive your conservation record went, how many projects you've been involved in, how many awards you received for your work in conservation. And I think, one of the sad things is that if this election goes and you are defeated, then we've lost a major voice probably in the country for conservation. And that's sort of the missing link here that people are just not catching on to, in my opinion.
Yes, well, you're absolutely right that conservation of our natural resources and securing access for our traditional activities in Maine, where we enjoy the great outdoors, whether that is fishing, trapping, and hunting, or bird watching and hiking, snowmobiling, ATV riding, canoeing, kayaking, which is something I particularly enjoy. Preserving that is part of our heritage. And as you know, I grew up in northern Maine, where responsible gun ownership is part of the heritage of virtually every family when I was growing up. And we also all went to our camps in the summer, where we learned to swim and to ride our boats and hike to the woods. And it's just always been part of who I am. And so it's probably natural that in the Senate, this has been a particular interest of mine. And early on, I worked with Ken Salazar, who went on to become a Secretary of the Interior, on the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And I know that at times it feels like we're not getting enough done in Washington, but let me tell you about a bill that was a really significant achievement. And it's called the Great American Outdoors Act. And it was signed into law in August. And it permanently funds the Land and Water Conservation Fund at the maximum level, which is $900 million a year, a level that's only been achieved twice in more than 50 years. And so that's going to bring stability to the fund. It's going to ensure that we have more opportunities for fishing and hunting. It's paired with another package that I co-sponsored, the John Dingell Conservation Management and Recreation Act, which also related to the Land and Water Conservation Fund. But this package also supported hunting and fishing opportunities by enacting an open until closed policy for public lands into law. And that makes it much more difficult for national anti-hunting groups to close off public land access to hunters. So those are accomplishments of which I'm proud. As you've mentioned, I am a member of the Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus. I recently received the Congressional Champion of 2019 award from Conserve America for my support of sound conservation policy. And I recognize that our sportsmen and women are great stewards of Maine's land, fish, and wild game population. And that the hunting that we do is really a critical game management tool. And I think that's often overlooked by anti-hunting groups of just how important that is.
Well, I think one of the things that I think is getting rare in politics now, and Mike, I don't know how you feel about this, but feel free to pipe in anytime you want, is that people that understand exactly what you were just talking about, when you were talking about camp, I remember when I was a kid, when I caught my first fish, it was a brook trout on Indian Pond, and I was with my dad, and he put me in the bottom of the boat. I was so little, I was sitting on a cushion in the middle of an aluminum boat, and I can still remember and smell the gasoline fumes from that when we were going across the lake. And I can remember my dad, he plunked me on the bank there in the sand, and God, my bobber went under, and I caught this brook trout. And I had never seen a fish, and in that where I had caught it, and I had it in my hands, and I dropped it in the sand, and it got all dirty. And I remember my dad saying, you don't want to rinse him off in the water. You're going to lose him. He only told me once. I went over and I washed it off, and he was gone.
Yeah.
but having candidates that understand our culture right down to its roots, whether you like to hike or you like to hunt, you like to fish, and respecting that culture and understanding the components. And I think that's the root. That's probably the reason that you're such a leader in conservation, is you come from a state where that's precious. We have these amazing resources in this culture, and it's just such a wonderful place to live, Maine.
A lot of people, I think, touching on a point, Senator, that you made, a lot of people don't realize the open till closed. We had that issue locally here in Maine in some of our conservation areas in regards to trails. There was the 300 foot on either side of a trail, which really kind of knocked out a whole lot of access for hunting. And the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine have been working on that issue.
Yes, and we've had some great success with that, with the Department of Conservation opening up. Now, some areas, obviously, Mike, that hunting is not appropriate on heavily used trails. But some trails, they don't get used in the fall, particularly during hunting season. There's no reason they couldn't be open to some level of hunting, and we are working to get that taken care of. It's not a federal law, it's a state. Yeah, and we'll get after that. One of the things Mike just touched on was saltwater fisheries. And it's one place where federal and state laws do overlap. And it does seem odd, Senator, that our rules going up and down the coast are so different from state to state. And I understand you've got to have some level of that, but it seems like a lot of our fisheries are being managed pretty heavily down in the southern part of New England. And by the time the fish like the stripers and others get up here, they've been picked over pretty hard by those southern states. So it is an area I see where we could have some more, more standard regulations up and down the coast. If they can catch, shorter stripers and many more fish in southern New England states. Maybe the rules should be the same.
As far as I know, Massachusetts still even has a commercial season on stripers.
Yeah, that's what I mean. That's what I'm talking about. They'll commercially fish them before they
People get them before they get here. Yeah,
exactly.
A friend of mine lives.
There's enough left to come up.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Senator.
I think you raised a really good point. I would, however, oppose the establishment of a requirement for a saltwater fishing license at the federal level. And I think that the registry is a better approach. And I think it would be really burdensome for anglers to have to get a saltwater fishing license. So there's some issues that the federal government gets involved in that I think are better left at the state level.
That's a good point.
An example of that is the Canadian lynx population, where I know the listing has diminished the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife's ability to manage coyote predation on deer, for example. And so I think that there's some areas where federal regulations are appropriate, but there are a lot of areas where it's best left up to the state.
Well, I can tell you that's music to my ears, because Maine did pass the saltwater fishing license back when I was a state senator, and Governor LePage had just won election at that time, and it had the previous 2 years. It was a big battle, and the Department of Marine Resources was successful in getting a saltwater fishing license. And the next year, I submitted legislation to repeal it and replace it with the registry you discussed, and for that exact reason, that you had mentioned, but also where the money goes. I think sportsmen and women are willing to pay money for a license or a tag if they know it's going to go in to preserve the resource. And in that case, it was going to go to something else. And so I think you appreciate it as well. You need to invest in those resources, and that's one place you've been able to deliver over and over for years is to get money to go into conservation.
That's absolutely true, and I'm proud of that, because that really matters to me. It matters to the state of Maine, to preserving our traditions, our heritage, and our way of life. I also think that a lot of times people overlook that in addition to being such an important part of our culture and our heritage, that recreational activities like hunting, fishing, and trapping are also vital to our economy in Maine. Our hunters and anglers spend more than $600 million a year. That supports 10,000 jobs, and that matters. I have worked hard as a member of the Senate Appropriations Committee to secure funding for Maine's 2 federal fish hatcheries, Craigslip Brook and Green Lake fish hatcheries, and those are important. And as you know, and I know that both of you, given your background, understand this really well, I am in line to become the next chair of the Appropriations Committee in the Senate when the current chair's term expires. And it's been since 1932 was the last time that a Maine senator had that most powerful position. It is the most powerful committee position in the entire Senate.
Well, it's funny that you say that, because I was just thinking the other day, I was speaking with a Democrat who will remain unnamed that is in state government, and I said to him, I said, you better hope Senator Collins gets elected. And this individual said to me, well, what are you talking about? You know I'm a Democrat. And I said, well, I suspect there'll be about $1.5 billion shortfall in the state budget. And if Senator Collins chairs the Appropriations Committee, your job's going to be a lot easier.
Exactly. And, when I look at the funding that I brought to Maine for transportation projects, whether it's roads or bridges or seaports or airports, it's $740 million since I got on the Appropriations Committee in 2009. And now that I'm chair of the Transportation Appropriations Subcommittee, Maine ranks number one per capita in the amount of money that we get from a key transportation construction program. And I got to tell you, that's not a coincidence. It really isn't.
No, it isn't.
And as you know, you can help prioritize funding. Even though we can't do earmarks anymore, I created a program that helps to replace bridges that are dilapidated and old or obsolete in rural states. Well, guess what state does really well with that program?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can tell you,
that's where you can make a difference.
Absolutely. And I think that Maine is unique in the country in that when tourism season comes, when the good months come in the summertime, people flock to Maine because they want to come here. They want to experience our nature, our mountains, rivers, our clean water. Where they come from, they're living in a place with pavement and concrete, and they come here, and you've got to have that proper and safe transportation throughout, not just the urban areas, but throughout suburban and rural Maine where people want to go. If they come to Maine and they destroy their car getting to a location up in a rural part of the state, they're unlikely to come back. So you have to have investments. But Maine is on the map nationally. We are a destination state. We have a big tourism industry, and we've got to be able to invest in our infrastructure or people just won't come. I would like to say this one more thing about it, Mike, and you can jump right in. People flock to our national parks because of their beauty. And I think Maine as a whole, its uniqueness across the state is like a national park. I think people treat it that way. You can play anywheres in the state.
Well, it's actually what I was gonna say. It's not a lot of people do come to the coast. The coast is obviously very beautiful, and there's a lot to see and do and like about the coast of Maine. But there's also a lot to do inland too. I mean, like Sebago Lake, Moosehead Lake.
Yeah, the chain of ponds up in...
so much interesting stuff in the inner end of Maine. And I saw a lot of that when I was a big snowmobiler, or when I go snowmobiling. You know, Katahdin Iron Works is really neat to visit. I could go on and on. I don't want to take up too much time on the radio show. But
that's okay, though, Mike. I mean, that's what makes us so unique.
You're so right. I mean, when I was growing up, as soon as school got out, the first thing we did is move to our camp at Madawaska Lake, and we spent the rest of the summer there. And I have a camp on Coldstream Pond in West Enfield now, and I don't get there as much as I would like, but, you know, it's a seasonal camp. We get the lake, the water comes from the lake. I've closed it up for the year now. I had to close it a little early given my schedule. But there's no place I'd rather be. No place I'd rather be. And we're so fortunate in Maine. I was in western Maine in the Bethel and then Rangeley area recently, and it's just so beautiful. In everywhere you go in our state, we are so fortunate. And it was been really interesting this year because I've seen so many people who have just summer homes in Maine coming much earlier and staying much later because of the pandemic. And real estate agents tell me they're seeing a real boom in people buying up property. And I think they realize what a special way of life that we have in Maine, and that if they can work anywhere, why not work from Maine? So it's going to be very interesting to see if we have a population boomlet in the more rural areas of the state. There's one other program that I want to make sure I mention, because it has been really critical to a lot of our hunting camps and other seasonal businesses, and that is the Paycheck Protection Program, which I was the lead author of and was included in the CARES Act, the coronavirus bill that we passed in March, but it's been extended 2 times since then by legislation. And this afternoon I'm going to go to the Senate floor and seek to move a bill separate from the rest of the coronavirus bill to see if we can get this, which has widespread support, enacted. And what this bill does, what this law does, is it gives forgivable loans to our small businesses. And it has, the intent is to keep them afloat and paying their employees and retaining their employees through this persistent pandemic. And so far, I'm pleased to say that 3 out of 4 of Maine's small businesses, and that includes a lot of our seasonal businesses, have received these loans, and they've received $2.3 billion worth of these loans. And as you know, that's almost equal to half of the state budget. And most important, it's helped to sustain 250,000 jobs. And that includes jobs in our hunting and fishing and recreational businesses as well. So it's something that I think we need another round of, given that a lot of these businesses lost the first half of the season in Maine. So I'm hoping I can get another round through.
Well, I can tell you that our organization appreciates it. Back when COVID hit as a nonprofit, I'm talking about Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine, not the political arm of SAM, but we applied for a small PPP loan, and it enabled us to keep our tiny little staff employed through the worst of this. All of our fundraising activities were shut down because of COVID. All of our meetings are 300, 400, 500. Our shows are attended by thousands of people. The
Sportsman Show.
The Sportsman Show is almost 10,000 people go through the doors at the Civic Center. All of that was shut down, and the PP loan sustained us. And we will likely have another COVID problem coming up this winter and into the spring. It is likely we'll need a second round to keep our staff employed. Now, we took some pain with that. We had major cuts. We all took cuts in our hours. The organization has had to scale back nearly all of its programs. But we can make it if we get that little bridge to 2021. So we do appreciate it. I know a lot of people do. I want to get this other point in there too, because I see some of the ads on TV criticizing you, like you intentionally went out there and left a loophole for big outfits to come in and apply for the money. I remind listeners that it's a voluntary program, and that if some chain or corporation out there went and misused that program or applied when it didn't need it, it's not Senator Collin's fault. It's the company. It's on them. And shame on them if they did that. I know some companies turned the money back in when it was found out that they had applied. When they had applied for the money. And
it's hard, too. As you know, when I was in the legislature, we would craft laws and they'd get passed.
Yeah.
And then 2 years later, we'd have to make some correction to it because you either overlooked something or you just didn't think that something was going to happen properly. Mike. And it takes sometimes a few years to get everything working perfectly, actually. Hopefully by that few years, COVID will be over with. So.
Exactly.
Right, let's hope so. But you're exactly right. And we've tightened up the restrictions on this latest version. And but, you know, one of the big issues was franchisees. And I was in a Subway shop in Lincoln recently, and the owner came over and said to me, "Thank God for the PPP program, because it allowed me to keep all of my employees going when our business was so off that I would have otherwise had to lay them off." And I'm glad for that. And the program was never intended for, like, the headquarters of Subway or any of these hotels, but these individual franchisees are responsible for their own profits and losses. And I think that was lost in the distortion, too.
It was lost.
But we put in extra audit money, and if there's people who have ripped off the program, shame on them. and
Exactly.
we'll pursue them.
Yeah, exactly. I also want to point out that the world of politics on both sides works this way now. If Senator Collins or any senator or representative comes up with a good idea, the other side immediately starts to try to find flaws in it that it can pick apart and demonize the other side, and it goes on both sides of the aisle. Instead of saying, hey, Senator Collins, I found a problem with this, let's fix it.
Yeah.
It becomes about the blame game and how they can politically maneuver to get a little advantage over the other side. And
especially during campaign season.
yes,
I
it's
noticed,
horrible.
Right.
I think people do, like after the election comes up and stuff, and once you're actually digging in and doing the work, at least when I was in the legislature with you, David,
Yeah.
it seemed like that kind of partisanship did fade substantially. And we were, at least
Yes.
in Maine, we were able to get a lot of stuff done, and we didn't, we
That's
weren't
right.
picking each other apart. We were working together, and I'd love to see that more on the federal end of things. Senator, would you like to comment on that?
Oh, I can't. I agree with you so completely. And we need to work together. And that's what I've always prided myself on doing. And I know that's what the Sportsman Alliance of Maine has always done. It's to try to bring people together, hammer out the issue, and not have it fall to partisan politics. There's far too much hyper-partisanship in Washington right now, and that is a shame. And it's not the way it used to be. It has gotten way worse. It was always pretty partisan in the election year, but in the off year, it wasn't partisan, and that's what we need to get back to. And that's one reason I was proud that the Paycheck Protection Program passed unanimously, and the changes we made passed unanimously. But I worry today that we may see a partisan vote because I know that there are some people who are taking an all-or-nothing approach. To me, if there are individual provisions of the House-passed coronavirus bill that there's bipartisan support for, let's get those passed. Let's get those signed into law and keep working in good faith on the rest. And that's what I'm known for. That's what I like to do. I like to solve problems, and we've really got to get back to that.
Yeah. Well, in a moment here, we have to take a quick break. I invite you to come back, and we can wrap this thing up after the break. But I can tell you that I watched this whole thing play out. I've been doing this for a long time, so have you, Mike. And it appears that Speaker Pelosi is overplaying her hand. I know that you want to use your caucus as leverage to get things added to a package that you want and see as priorities for your caucus. But ultimately, it's sort of like slowing the fire truck down to a fire. If you get there and there's nobody in the structure, you might be able to salvage it. But after a while, if the fire truck can't get there in time, it goes flat and there's nothing to salvage. And it feels like that's the point we're at, is that if they don't get to the fire soon, which is the American people and their businesses and our economy, then we're going to burn to the ground and there won't be anything to salvage. With that, we'll come back in a few minutes and we'll wrap this thing up. We'll be right back.
Leadership Through Action, a presentation of SAM ILA. We'll be right back. Leadership Through Action is back. Here's David Trahan.
Welcome back to Sportsman's Alliance Maine Institute for Legislative Action radio program, Leadership Through Action, with Dave and Mike. Before the break, we were talking with Senator Collins, and we had hoped to give her a moment to say, thank you and goodbye to folks on the radio, but she got pulled away. She has a job to do in the Senate. I guess this afternoon she's introducing a pretty important bill, and she needs to prepare for that. So unfortunately, she couldn't say goodbye. So we'll do that for her.
Yeah.
Goodbye and
thank
good
you,
luck.
Senator.
Yeah, thank you,
for
Senator.
joining us.
Yeah, and good luck.
Yeah.
With that, Mike, we got a short little segment here before we get to Matt Dunlap, Secretary of State, to talk about ranked choice voting.
Yeah, well, I was just, you gave the story of your first fish, and I don't remember my first fish, but it's a funny story. My family had a summer camp too, right here in Monmouth, and actually, they take so much upkeep. My father was always working around the camp, so what happened was, it was my mother actually that would bring me out fishing all the time. And we had a little rowboat with a 4-horse, and she'd be back there, running the 4-horse. Yep. And we would troll, around the lake, and we'd catch white perch and pickerel and all that kind of stuff. And it was really neat. This where the senator was, recollecting about her camp experience and how right after school they'd head right off and stuff. And
Yeah.
we didn't get to spend as much time as the whole summer up there when I was a kid, but I loved my time at camp.
Oh.
And it was really, and I think also having seen my father always working, and I do a lot of work around the camp now too. I mean,
Yes,
I literally tear the place
I was
up.
telling you that's why you're not doing as much recreational fishing and hunting as you used to.
Exactly. And then this weekend is going to be all finishing up a big project. But I think that that my time at camp showed me a good ethic on you have to actually do the work to keep the things that you like my father was doing, and at the same time I loved it that now I look back and I just love it that my mother was the one that really got me into fishing. So
Wow. My mom, I remember speaking of moms fishing up on Caratunk boat landing as a kid, and I remember I was fishing, and I was an intense fisherman. I mean, I was concentrating on that, and just a little fella. And my mom, I had to go do something real quick, and I said, "Mom, would you hold my fishing pole?" And I had been fishing for a long time, and all I was catching was little rivet chubs and stuff. And to me, that was fun. But next thing I know, I hear the screaming going on, and she had a landlocked salmon on, and it was flopping out of the water, and she dragged it up on the shore and on my fishing pole.
Always happens.
We talk about that once in a while.
When you step away, you always get the big one.
So with that, we're going to break here. We just wanted a little short segment to thank the senator, and we'll come right back in a minute, and we'll talk about something more serious, and that is making sure that your vote counts this November. And with that,
With the Secretary of State, Matt Dunlap.
Yes, Matt Dunlap, Secretary of State. So we'll be right back.
Leadership Through Action, a presentation of SAM ILA. We'll be right back. Leadership Through Action is back. Here's David Trahan.
Welcome back to Leadership Through Action, a production of the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine Institute for Legislative Action with Dave and Mike. Mike, we have a special guest. You want to introduce him?
Yeah, we have the Secretary of State, a good friend of ours, fellow sportsman. And,
held my job, too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
he did.
yeah.
He was executive director of the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine, too. Yeah, I totally forgot about that.
Yeah.
Matt, welcome. Love to have you. Love having you, I should say.
Two of my favorite people.
Well, Matthew, I've been at this business for a long time, and I'm still not quite sure how to vote under the new ranked choice voting process. And we were hoping to have you explain this to folks so that when they vote, that they make sure that their vote counts appropriately and it's part of the mix. Can you run us down through ranked choice voting for just a few minutes?
Sure. And just to give a little bit of background on voting, no two states handle elections exactly the same way. And when we were in the legislature together, they were already talking about some type of a runoff system. Because in Maine, the law says whoever gets the biggest pile of votes wins. Whether it's by plurality. And a plurality can be 60% of the vote. It can also be 40% of the vote. And we've had a number of elections over the last, 20, 30 years, especially running for governor, where, the winner gets like 35% of the vote. And that was that way when Angus King first ran. For both of Governor Baldacci's elections, he didn't crest 40%. Governor LePage's first election, he got about 39%. And so there's this sense that we should try to find consensus. And this was done by initiative. Rather than have an expensive runoff system, we do it all on one ballot. And this has confused a few people. I'll tell you, when we first began designing it,
wait a second, though,
going
Matt.
through all the turgid history of ranked choice voting and the politics behind it and the legal fights around it, when we first began designing the ranked choice grid-style ballot and we put it out there for public comment, one of the really gratifying things about that was that the questions that we got from the public were actually very thoughtful questions. So the way it works, and let me just cut to the chase, the number one question that we get about ranked choice voting is, do I have to use it? Do I have to rank my choices, or can I just vote for David Trahan and leave it there? Well, as a matter of fact, you can do exactly that. We spent a lot of time as we were setting up ranked choice voting understanding we have a fair amount of fluency in voter behavior and what voters tend to do. One of the things they don't do is they don't follow instructions. So we know that going out of the gate. Like when, and I don't say that to run down voters, but the instructions on the ballot, like fill in the oval next to the name of the candidate that you want to select, and people do everything else. They put an X through the oval, they check mark. Sometimes they'll just draw a big circle around the name of the candidate. And our laws, which are pretty thoughtfully crafted around securing voter intent, those count as votes. So, with that understanding, as we were designing the system around ranked choice voting, we understood that, maybe you don't really love anybody, and you might start ranking at choice 2. Well, that counts. You can skip a ranking. You can't skip 2, but you can skip 1. And the algorithm that sorts all this will simply move that to a first place vote. But if you want to throw that symbolic second choice as your starting point, you can. You can vote for just one candidate. You can vote for that one candidate. Like in this presidential cycle, there are 5 people on the ballot for President of the United States. If you want just your top choice, you can mark them your first choice, second choice, third choice, fourth choice, fifth choice. Does not invalidate your vote. Now, that vote only follows that candidate if we do rankings and that candidate makes it to the final round. It only really counts once, but it doesn't invalidate your vote. What does invalidate your vote is if you have that same grid with 5 candidates, if you give every single one of them a first place choice, well, then we don't know what you mean. And that would invalidate the vote.
I get it.
So,
I get it.
But by and large, you control your vote, and that's how it works.
Right. And I get that. I understand that because, number one, which number one? Are we just supposed to guess here? I do have a question. I think you just clarified it. If let's say that John Smith is my choice for president, and I put John Smith in all the spots. Okay, so in round 1, John Smith gets 48% of the vote. In round 2, does my second choice, John Smith, get counted?
No, your first choice follows John Smith. So if John Smith gets 48% of the vote, and and let me just tell you a little anecdote. When we first designed this to show to the public, it took my breath away because our folks put it together using the actual names on the actual ballot. I said, no, don't do that, because people are going to think I'm pushing for some candidate to try to show how, someone wins, right? And we don't want that. So that's why if you look at our website, and we have a little video that explains how this works. In one instance, we use colors like red, blue, and orange, and purple. And in the actual sample ballot, we use like Spider-Man, Wonder Woman, et cetera. So if you have, like, say, John Smith, all right, and Superman, okay, Superman is at 46% and John Smith is at 48%, but then you have, Captain America at 8%. Well, Captain America is eliminated because he only has 8%. And you would take all those voters who made Captain America their first choice. Any subsequent rankings that they gave to the other candidates, either John Smith or Superman, if they ranked John Smith second as their second choice, well, then you redistribute that second choice to John Smith and et cetera, and then you retabulate. And it's basically whoever gets a majority of the votes in the last round. So let's use a real-world example to explain both how this works and what it's designed to avoid.
Before you do that, though, I have a clarification before you go on to that example. It feels to me, and maybe it's just anecdotal, and maybe you can clear that up. It feels like if you're one of the supporters of the top 2 candidates, let's say that in the presidential race that between Trump and Biden, if neither one of them gets to the 50% threshold, and you don't pick a second choice, you have your one choice, then you don't have any more votes. It feels
works
like
exactly the same way as it does in a plurality election.
Correct. But
so let's just say that you pick Joe Jorgensen, the Libertarian, as your only choice, and Joe Jorgensen is eliminated in the first round. Well, you voted for one guy or one woman, and that candidate lost the same way as in a plurality election. Like, again, that's why I always say you control your vote.
Right, but
now,
this
if you
is
choose to rank, and let's get into some of the real-world examples. Let's start with...
Well, wait a minute, Matt, before you go any further, I want to clarify this point because it's very important, and it's one question that I've had and I've discussed with a lot of people, is that if you have just the one choice, it appears as if minority groups that can maybe band their votes together or say, hey, let's make our second choice Mrs. Jones or Mr. Jones. And they do understand how to rank their candidates. It feels like the minority is selecting the majority's candidate by ranking when the others don't. So you have somebody with 48%, but because their supporters didn't rank a second choice, then those minorities then choose the candidate.
Well, let's illustrate that in real elections. So let's start with what ranked choice voting is designed to avoid. So let's go back to the presidential election of 1992, when George Herbert Walker Bush, the incumbent, was running against Bill Clinton, Governor Clinton, and Ross Perot. And I remember Ross Perot started the Reform Party. He's fairly conservative. Now, in the election, Perot did really well. In fact, I think he actually won Maine, as a matter of fact.
He did.
He pulled enough votes away from George Bush that Bill Clinton wound up getting elected president. So now you go to a real-world example, and frankly, with ranked choice voting, our limited historical knowledge of it explains something that's not terribly dramatic, which is whoever tends to lead in the first round tends to win. So you take, Mike Brennan, when he was mayor of Portland. That was the first time he used ranked choice voting. It was like a 15-way race for mayor. Mike Brennan led through every round and wound up getting elected mayor. And that's always worked out that way. And in the times that we used it in the primaries in 2018, that's how it played out. Janet Mills was leading through every round of the gubernatorial primary in the Democratic side of the ballot. So, but now you have the second CD race in 2018, and this is how it can work. And it has to be a circumstance just this close. On election night, Bruce Poliquin was leading Jared Golden by about 2,000 votes. But you had two independents in the race. You had Will Hoare and Tiffany Bond. Together, they combined for about 23,000 votes. The operative question, to your point, David, was did those voters rank choices, or did they just cast protest votes? And as a matter of fact, about half of them did, in fact, rank choices. And by a factor of about 2-1, because they are both progressive independents, they ranked their second choices for Golden. So Golden wound up winning by about 3,500 votes in the second round. So you have to have a fairly sizable pile of second place pending votes and a very close election to actually affect avoiding that spoiler effect that I described in the presidential election of 1992. So people ask questions about voting strategically. If should I rank, or should I only just vote for my one person? And what I always tell people is that you do what you want to do. And what it allows you to do. Let's take this presidential election. Say you're somebody who's a strong conservative and you really, really like the idea of a libertarian candidate, but you really don't want Biden. Ranked choice voting allows you to give Jorgensen a first-place vote, and you can give your second-place choice to Trump, say, or one of the other conservative candidates, and not rank Biden at all if you don't want to. And that way, the payoff for me in this was after we did it the first couple of times, I'd be in Old Town at the grocery store, and people would see me, people who don't follow this. I know you'd be shocked to hear that not everybody hangs on my every word, but there are people who don't read the paper and don't follow this, and they'd stop me in the grocery store and say, I really like the idea of being able to vote for somebody I admire without inadvertently electing somebody I hate. And that's sort of what it is designed to do. Now, whether or not it actually affects that or not really depends on how people vote and how they cast their ballots. Even though I know that, like in the Republican side of the aisle, the political spectrum, a lot of Republicans don't like ranked choice voting. But what we saw in this last primary for Congress, I can't remember how many votes Eric Brakey got. He got like 20,000 votes. Only about 800 people did not rank their choices who just voted for Brakey. So they may not like it, but they use it. And I think it's because they can sort of spread their support out through an entire field and rank their choices according to like how progressive or how conservative or how much they like somebody's message in a crowded field on a ballot.
Yeah. The point that I was trying to make, though, is that if you have progressive groups like we've seen recently with lots of money, really good organization, this country we honor our system by ruling through the majority of people. In other words, at election time, a majority of people dictate the laws we live under. They elect our officials. If you're in a small group in a state like Maine that leans moderate to not progressive, but somewhere on the left of center.
Purple's a good way to put it.
Yeah, and you have these smaller groups that say, hey, we can have an impact. If this was within a point or two of 50% for either candidate, we can make a difference by pooling all of our votes and saying, hey, let's all vote as our second choice. Let's vote for our progressive candidate first, and then everybody vote for this candidate second, and we can bump them over the top. And that's a manipulation by a small minority of the voters of our voting system. So how do we get at that, Matt? How do we make sure that doesn't happen?
I don't understand that. I don't see how that would work.
I think what you're describing, David, would take a degree of coordination and systemic communication that would almost be biblical in scale, even for a couple of thousand people. You remember back when term limits first took effect, John Martin was termed out of office, and he ran as a write-in. He ran anyway. And he would have won that election, but because he ran as a write-in and under the election laws at the time, that not only did you have to write in the name, but you also had to connect the arrow or fill in the oval. Well, about 400 people didn't do that. So their votes couldn't be counted. Now, like I say, we've done a lot of work on voter intent since that time. But, John Martin was pretty popular up there, and they really wanted him as their representative. And his intent was to challenge the term limits law. Of course, that never happened because he didn't win the election. But, it takes a profound amount of sort of cooperation between a group of people that I don't know if you could really affect very easily. Will Rogers said, I don't belong to an organized party. I'm a Democrat. And I think there's a lot of truth in that, in any party situation where getting a group of voters to agree to do what you just described. Yeah. They say, look, we're going to push our guy over the top by, voting for a third-party candidate as our first place and then another candidate as our second choice. And frankly, campaigns have tried to embrace that. If you remember in the Democratic gubernatorial primary, there were TV ads featuring, former House Speaker Mark Eves and Betsy Sweet saying, and they took turns saying, vote for me, one, vote for her, two, vote for him, two,
exactly.
Vote for me, one.
Yeah.
And neither one of them got out of the second round, but, it changes the nature of campaigning as much as anything that way, although it's still too early to see how much it's changing. It's like absentee balloting. When we took away the restrictions on absentee balloting, it went from being 5% turnout to 35% turnout to now it's probably going to be 60 or 65% turnout. And that changes how campaigns operate. You can't hold back all your resources for that Halloween surprise. Mm-hmm. Because by that time, as many as a third or two-thirds of your voters have already cast ballots. So, the campaigns have to adjust, is what I'm saying. And I think that's going to mean the candidates adjusting their campaigns, not the voters.
Yeah. Well, why I asked you the question is I was quite disturbed when I saw, because I do my research, Matt, and you know that. And I'm looking at Lisa Savage for U.S. Senate, a statement from her that says, Mainers enthusiastically endorse independent Lisa Savage for U.S. Senate. We also recommend voters mark Democrat Sara Gideon second on their ranked choice voting ballot. So there is this going on. It's the third time I've seen a very small percentage of voters, supporting one candidate and then the same candidate endorsing another candidate as a second rounder. So it is going on. It's something I think we have to deal with, Matt. I know there's pros and cons to ranked choice voting, and I think you're probably the best guy to explain it of anybody in our state, and I do appreciate you doing that. Unfortunately,
let's go back to what I described about the Pollock and Golden race. Because again, you had those third-party candidates. Question was, how many of them ranked? About half.
Yeah.
So I think with Lisa Savage, who knows how this is going to turn out? But there are just as many people out there who probably only want to vote for her as there are people who only want to vote for Trump or only want to vote for Biden or one of the other top of the ticket candidates. So that'll have to bear itself out over time, and I think there probably will be some. There's going to need to be some legislative adjustments.
Yeah, well,
the whole process in order to either use it fully or put sideboards on it.
Yeah.
And the legislature always revisits election law after every cycle, really into response to concerns like this.
Well, the sheriff over here is telling me we're out of time. Matt, I do really appreciate you coming on explaining. I think we're out of time, unfortunately, and we can have you back on maybe if we have time before the election to explain this further. I don't want to focus completely on this element of it, but it is a piece that I think we need to address in the future. And it's an Achilles heel for the ranked choice voting system. If this continues, it will undermine its credibility, and it won't be just a few years before it gets exposed and the legislature will have to shut it down. But anyway, with that, we really thank you, Matt. Maybe we'll have you back on next week if we have time, and you can spare it in your time to explain ranked choice voting even further so people can really understand it.
I'm happy to try.
Okay, well, thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Matt.
And we do have to wrap up this week's show, and hopefully we'll have some listeners next week.
This has been Leadership Through Action, presented by the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine's Institute for Legislative Action. Become a member of SAM today by visiting sportsmansallianceofmaine.org.